Hello! Today we're talking about Han Kang, Human Acts. A couple of months ago, I think back in January, I reviewed another book of hers called The Vegetarian, and might be last year, might be sometime this year, I reviewed this one, The White Book. And I finally got around to reading her third book, The Human Acts. I mean, it's not in that order that she published them, it's just in that order that I read them. I don't know if any of her other works have yet been translated to English, but I know that for sure these three ones are the most popular. And because this is not my first time talking about Han Kang, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but she is a South Korean author who was born in Gwangju, and then she moves to a place near Seoul, and she is kind of one of the most, I guess she's one of the more popular Korean authors, especially after her book The Vegetarian. I think that one got really popularized and people started looking into her other works as well. I don't know what, I think I was watching an interview of hers. I'll put it up here and I'll link it down below as well for you guys to watch, because I think if you're going to read this book and after that it'll make you feel very empty, go and watch that video, because I was like, oh my god, my life kind of just felt very like this whole just materialized out of nowhere. I didn't know what to do, and I watched that and I was like, oh my god, like her writing, no wonder I'm so, after I watched that interview I was like, okay, no wonder I feel the way I feel after reading her books, because just listening to her, even, it was just so strange. If you guys are a fan of BTS, tell me the way she talks doesn't remind you of Yoongi. If you guys are interested in kind of South Korea or South Korean history, you might have heard of the Gwangju uprising. It was many refer to it as a massacre, and I do believe that rightfully it should be termed as a massacre, because it was this uprising that happened in a southern part of South Korea. It was more like a student movement at the time it started, and others joined. A lot of people, including myself, are under the impression that when the two Koreas separated, there was difference between how it was run and how it was governed and the fate of the people in the two countries. But for a long time, South Korea had a similar, I wouldn't say similar, but as quite bad of an experience in terms of who was ruling the country and what types of lives people led and how much rights they had and how much freedom they had. So especially at the time of the president, I'm gonna refer to it in the introduction, Park Chung-hee, during his time, and then the person who stepped in after him, Jeong-dae. I mean, it's in the introduction. I would really recommend reading the introduction and also reading about that period in South Korea a little bit, because it will give you a lot more perspective. It was a period of turmoil, and it was only during the, I would say, 90s that things started getting better. And back in 2013, when the book was published, the daughter of Park Chung-hee, who was at the time a dictator, she was actually re-elected, I believe, as the president of Korea. So when this book was published, she was re-elected, and I guess it was kind of just, it happened like that, or it was timed like that. But it made me look into that time period in Korea in a lot more detail, and I'm very happy I did, because some of the things that I learned, I don't think I would have ever looked into it had it not been for this book. If you find most topics to be overdone or most feelings to be kind of over, I guess, exaggerated, Han Kang is a really interesting author to read, because I feel like this author clearly shows my progression in terms of the types of books I read. I went from reading books like How to Not Give an F, stuff like that, to now actually learning how to give a damn about things and give a damn about the world. And it's really sad that the most postmodernist kind of writing is a lot about like the self, and it's very much about the ignorance that people can feel comfortable living with. If I can say so about myself, up until a certain point I thought, it was okay to not want to know more, because I was always so overwhelmed and I can be in this little bubble, and because this is what feels comfortable to me. But actually there is so much beyond that it's worth knowing, it's worth feeling. I think she does a very good job of actually making people feel in a way that doesn't overwhelm you, but rather makes you question why all this time you were trying to not give enough, when clearly we need to care. We need to learn how to care again. We need to learn how to care about the world and people around us. And this book made me care so deeply about so many different things, not just about the situation that she covered, but in general, so much. And there was another aspect, which was guilt. So I'll take a quick kind of break to talk about the premise in the book, and then I'll come up to the second aspect. So the book starts off just straight up, you're put in the middle of an uprising and it's happening. And I believe it lasted about 10 days, and there was very heavy military action taken towards against the people who actually participated. But the thing is, the lines are very blurred. At the time it happened, there was a lot of talk about how this was kind of a communist uprising, and they were called like the Reds, and this was just students. And during the first thing that happened, none of them were armed. So why did it happen? Why was this story for such a long time covered up? The entire book is from the perspective, so the different chapters are from the perspectives of the different people involved in the uprising, or this part of the story that she's talking about. But the very last chapter, I think, is called the narrator, the epilogue, where she gives a little bit of an account of why she chose to talk about this issue and why she chose to write about it. Because she was born in Gwangju, and only a few months before this happened, her family moved to Seoul. So she feels like she almost just escaped it. And this story is kind of about someone who then resides in the house that she used to live in. She talks about growing up, she saw something on TV. I mean, it's a little bit blurred. I should have taken notes of that. But she says she sees something on TV, and she goes, "That's Gwangju," referring to something completely different. So what it started to be associated with, and what it means to her, and really she went back after many years, trying to learn about what happened there and learn about the people who lived in the house that she used to live in. And at the time, there was no one spared in the city, no one who was not affected in a certain way. And she kind of lives with that guilt of like, what makes me special? Why did I survive this? And as a survivor, I guess the survivor's guilt, or in this case, someone who wasn't even there, but in a way feels like she might as well have been, because she lived there, like it was her world at the time, because she was born there, she lived there for the first 9 years of her life, and right as she moved, this happened. I read a couple of other blogs about people who had similar experiences to Han Kang, where they read this book, they learned about the Gwangju uprising, and although they no longer live in Gwangju, they went back and tried to kind of, I guess, almost like when people talk about dark tourism or going to places where something gruesome has happened, what do you expect in these places? Or a very good example is a chapter in this book called The Editor, where they're trying to get someone to talk about these experiences many years, in the future. And it's like, okay, yes, you want to, I guess, dig up the past and you want to talk about it, but why? Like, what are you expecting to feel from it? What are you expecting to get from it? I mean, we know that it's important to bring certain things to surface so that it doesn't happen again, or people are aware of what's happened in the past. If things are buried, they're going to keep happening again and again. But in terms of that person to person, like going and asking someone, you spent a couple of years in prison after this happened, what happened there? Or in the case of the there's this chapter called The Factory Girl, and in her case, she just refused to ever talk about what happened to her. And you learn about like her time before, like during the time of the uprising and many years later. And it kind of also puts into perspective. A lot of the times books talk about things that have happened and talk about that event, but this kind of spans, I guess, a longer time period, where you get to learn about what happened to these characters after the uprising many years into the future, where you think like, if they survived, that was it, right? They survived. But the story never really ends there, and you get to hear it from the perspective of several different people who came out of it with completely different experiences. Both this book and The Vegetarian, I mean, I went into it completely like not knowing what is the story about, what is the book about. I mean, I knew a little bit about the Gwangju uprising, but I always wanted to know about it. I didn't know this book was about it. So sometimes in life you manifest things to happen. The other day I was reading about the Tiananmen Square massacre in Hong Kong. I believe that was in 1989, and it kind of gave me like, you know, so many of these things happen, and it might be happening right now and might be being, you know, covered up, and we don't really hear about it. Many years later you learn about what really happened, and it makes you kind of question your inaction or your part in it. It's much easier, I guess. A very good way to put it is that she questions people's inability to empathize with a past that doesn't have any resemblance to their present, just because we don't feel like, or a different world that doesn't have any resemblance to their world. Just because it's not happening directly around you doesn't mean it doesn't in certain way affect you. I guess in a lot of the times it's easier to be removed or keep yourself separate from a lot of things, but sometimes certain things bring you a perspective and give you perspective. And I guess the scarier thing is if more people feel the way I once felt, which is like, it's okay, if I can't deal with it, I'll choose to be ignorant. And this I'm talking about myself like maybe 10 years ago when I was still in school, and I found learning about all of these parts of history very overwhelming. And I don't find it embarrassing to say that. I think I was very overly sensitive. Every time I heard about anything like that, it would be in my mind for multiple days at a time, and I couldn't shake the thought of it. I mean, Han Kang herself talks about how she had multiple, you know, weeks of just traumatic dreams, and like she went through a lot writing it, and she doesn't expect the readers to go through anything less. So, you know, in a way, I guess I've toughened up now. I see why it's important to know certain things and why it's important to have more perspective on the world we live in. But it's definitely something I hope more people, you know, move towards and open themselves up to. The writing was absolutely beautiful. I do want to say something about the translator, Deborah Smith. So the introduction by Deborah Smith is, I would say, as beautiful as the rest of the book, because it gives you the perfect introduction to Han Kang and about the story. And like sometimes I skip the introduction. I'm like, I want to be completely immersed. I don't want to know someone else's perspective before I get into the book. But in this case, I read it in The Vegetarian and also this. And Deborah Smith is actually I believe she's the founder of the publishing company called Tilted Axis, and I read their book Tokyo Ueno Station, and I didn't know that this was like a kind of translation focused. It has such incredible books. If you're looking for incredibly good translated works from countries that don't have a lot of translated works available, go check out Tilted Axis. I found so many books to add to my reading list after this. I'm so glad. There's this little part that in the book where it's basically about what happens when certain people choose to be a part of something like this, and why certain other people don't. What is the motivation at the end of the day when you know you might die and you still choose to be a part of it? She kind of talks about it in like multiple different layers, and it comes to this, and I really wanted to share this part with you. Those snapshot moments when it seemed we'd all performed the miracle of stepping outside the shell of our own selves, one person's tender skin coming into grace contact with another. It felt as though they were rethreading the sinews of that world heart, patching up the fissures from which blood had flowed, making it beat again. The brilliance of that moment, the dazzling purity of conscience. Perhaps they would have considered even death a fair exchange for that jewel of conscience. A question I have, I guess, is why are some images available online of the uprising in black and white while there are some in color? Are we trying, again, that whole thing, if you haven't read Susan Sontag's Regarding the Pain of Others or On Photography, very important question to ask, or even in your own history books, look at why pictures from fairly recent history are put in black and white, to give us the impression this happened a long time ago. I was born in 1994. There are people still being hunted for this at the time, so it's not really a long time ago. So why does that happen? I guess overall she kind of questions in this book this kind of uniform brutality that was happening in different parts of the world over the last 100 years. A lot of the times you have this tendency to glamorize certain decades based with one word, you know, the swinging 60s or this 20s, whatever it is, but you forget that an entire decade a lot happened, and there is so much more to it than whatever, you know, is like the glamorized memory we have of certain decades. And so much happened in the last 100 years that we probably still don't know. It's easier for us now to look back on those decades and remember the westernized, I guess, history, which and remember Western history, so you remember disco, you remember the type of dances that were associated with the decades, but very few people remember what, you know, a lot of the other things that happened. So I guess it was a thought into that, but also into this whole guilt of inaction. As someone who was there, you know, if you were there was very little that you could have done. And people here, like, she questions again and again, they know they couldn't have done anything, and why were they still willing to participate? And same thing with us, like, if you're sitting here and you're watching these, you know, televised, I guess, like, atrocities that are happening around the world, this weight of inaction that sits on our hearts and sits in our minds, it's not something that is just you or just me, it's with everyone. It's like, I'm not doing anything, I want to do something, I feel so helpless and I feel so just cut off from the world. And I guess she portrayed that in the last chapter very, very, I teared up at the end. I was like, I'm not someone who cries in books, but this definitely jerked a few tears. That's my review on Han Kang. If you want to feel, I do recommend this. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this review. I feel like I would go on so many tangents during my review, but yeah, if you want to pick up Han Kang, if you're looking for a Korean author to read, I would definitely recommend her. So yeah, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you guys later. Bye.